speaker, before this next speaker comes up, I do want to share a little anecdote of a story. If those of you did look at the program online, you know who our next speaker is. But as I mentioned before, I'm a transgender man, and I've been in my transition for going on 12 years. And with that comes a lot of interesting situations we run into with doctors' offices and things like that. And so about 4 years ago, and I'll tell you, my body took the testosterone right away, gave myself an injection, back hair. And then, you know, a few months later, I started getting a little mustache and things like that. And ever since then, I love the beard. I can't live without the beard. I love seeing it in the mirror. It's a very strong expression of my masculinity. So about 6 years ago, I go to one of those emergency clinics inside of a CVS because I have a really bad sinus infection. I've got headaches, I'm having issues, and so when I go in to see the registered nurse, she gives me a look up and down, and my ID at the time said female, and my name said Dylan. And so she sits across from me, and she crosses her legs, and she crosses her arms, and she says, I know what the problem is. She goes, it's because you're taking estrogen. And your body's not used to estrogen, and so you're getting migraines, and now you have a sinus infection. And your reaction was a reaction. And so I take a look at this lady and I go, oh no, this is my final form. And so I got to have a conversation with her one-on-one at the point that I take testosterone, and this is not okay to do to someone. You can't assume that someone's having these effects because of XYZ. You know, this isn't why I'm here. I'm here because I need antibiotics because my face holes are all clogged up and I'm having ear pain. You know, and so how many of us have a story similar to something like that? We have experienced it. But one of the most important parts about the trans experience in the healthcare system is we can't lose sight of where we've come from, right? So a lot of our accomplices in the room, you might not know a lot about like trans health history. That's fine, I don't expect you to. And some of the people here, like we struggle so hard just to survive, you might not have done research into the trans medical history. But what I will say is that our next speaker has this amazing book called Trans Medicine, The Emergence and Practice of Treating Gender, which is, it's a great, like, I wouldn't say it's a great start into, it's a great place to help build a foundation and gain like higher understanding, because you can watch like a YouTube video to get a one-on-one, and you have great talks on YouTube to get a really basic one-on-one, but this is a great way to gain an advanced level of discussion of trans health and medicine. So with that being said, I'm grateful to welcome our next speaker, Stef Shuster, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Michigan State University. Their current research in gender, medicine, and feminist science studies considers how expertise and evidence is constructed, mobilized, and weaponized, which is the subject of their book, Trans Medicine, The Emergence and Practice of Treating Gender. In Trans Medicine, Shuster traces the development of this medical field from the 1950s to modern medicine to show how providers create and use scientific and medical evidence to quell uncertainty, treat gender identity, and uphold their authority. So everybody here, please give a warm welcome to our next speaker, Stef Shuster.
Sorry, let me just like get set up here for a second. I'm so used to like Zooming with my student that I'm like, it doesn't matter what's happening behind me and my cat is howling in the background. It's like just me in this box. So, yeah, give me 1 second. And also, I don't think I told anyone this. I'm turning 40 tomorrow. Yeah. And so I need these guys here, so I'm gonna put these on. And my cat turned 22 today. So yeah, my beloved cat, her name's Sketch, and she was with me since I was a first-year college student. My parents are still completely just taken aback that I'm still like I resisted going to college, and then I got there, and then I was like, fuck, I don't want to leave. So I became a professor, and they're still astounded by that. So, okay, I think I'm set up. I've got 30 minutes. I'm a social scientist. I am going to mostly tell stories as everyone continues eating their dinner and enjoying this lovely evening. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is based on the book that I wrote, which still feels weird to say as a kid who always felt like I was a scrappy kid in the corner. And now I'm like, yeah, I've got a book. Yeah, so I'm gonna tell stories, and I'm really going to outline what I see as a lot of the continued challenges in trans medicine, and how that also relates to where we are now and what we might possibly hold on to in the tiny grappling hooks of hope that we can see in trans medicine. And as a social scientist, I've got to start with the opening scene. So I want you to imagine that we are in an audience of 300 people in a darkened, is this? I have trouble hearing you in the back, so it might be the microphone. Better? All right. Fuck, wait, did you not hear what I said like the whole time? I'm just like talking to myself now. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started, and what I'm starting with is an opening scene from a lot of my time going around and doing observations of trans healthcare conferences, and those are moments where doctors are trying to teach each other. Okay, so here we go. A young medical doctor tentatively raises her hand in a darkened auditorium that holds 300 of her peers and asks the panelists at a transgender healthcare conference how they make decisions about enabling or blocking access to hormones for their trans patients. The young doctor continues to reflect upon how she struggles the most with patients who are non-binary identified, meaning that their gender identities are neither woman nor man, but somewhere outside or beyond these categories. One panelist who's worked in trans medicine for over 20 years chuckles, leans into the microphone, and explains that, quote, it's sort of like Spidey sense, you know? You have to feel it out. The audience, as I just heard, the audience nervously laughs while nodding their heads in agreement that when handling uncertainty in medical decision-making with trans people, one must trust their gut instinct or so-called Spidey sense. Sitting in the audience, I was taken aback at this exchange. So all of the training that medical providers receive in internships, in residency programs, and in the years beyond medical school advances their knowledge and confidence about offering the best medical treatment possible. They look to publish research when they're presented with ambiguous cases. They call each other on the phone or knock on their colleagues' doors when they're unsure how to diagnose or treat patients. And to maintain their licenses to practice medicine, they're also expected to continue their education through regularly attending conferences. All of these different kinds of activities help providers develop what they refer to as a gut instinct about making medical decisions when managing uncertainty. Sorry, I'm hearing the Michigan in my own voice, and I'm like, I'm not even from Michigan, but I've been there long enough that I have a Michigan accent now. Okay, so here's what happens. In medical emergencies, relying on gut instinct can help providers quickly make decisions, which can become life or death matters for their patients. But when confronted with uncertainty in medical decisions that are not quite so immediate, what factors are at play in developing and using a gut instinct? Social science research consistently documents that there are multiple ways that exist to justify refusing or allowing trans interventions by providers. What is less understood is how informal and subjective evidence becomes crystallized, established, and perpetuated as providers begin to accumulate knowledge and experience in gender-affirming interventions. So my book, Trans Medicine, begins as an acknowledgement that providers of trans medicine have an established authority over gender, and asks, how has medical authority over gender happened? What has become normal and legitimate through decades of practice in trans medicine? And what are the consequences of these trends for trans medicine and the medical establishment more broadly? My book is an effort to move towards these answers and find opportunities for a more inclusive and just healthcare system. Let me tell you just a little bit about how I started this project. I started working on this project before I even knew it was going to be a book project. I got to Iowa City, Iowa in 2007. I didn't know anything about Iowa other than it had lots of corn and soy. I grew up in Kentucky. I had already identified, maybe we've got an Iowa person over here. I had already identified as a queer, trans, and non-binary person for quite some time. But tenuous finances and constant movement across state lines from Kentucky to Indiana to Iowa to California and back, and it was just like ping-ponging across the Midwest and the West. Meant that I identified as a queer and trans person, but I had never really had the opportunity to work with a doctor to begin a physical transition. So when I got to Iowa City in 2000, I started asking around to find out which providers were knowledgeable about trans-affirming care, and I was struck with blank stares from colleagues, and even from friends in the Iowa City trans community. So I decided to change that. I began meeting with providers, organizing workshops, and helping them become updated on how to work in affirming ways with trans and non-binary clients. And it was years and years and years of advocacy work and getting healthcare providers who said that they were interested in working with trans people, but they felt like they didn't know how to work with trans people. And after a couple of years of working with them, I gained insight into the kinds of dilemmas in trans medicine that providers felt unequipped to navigate. But meanwhile, let's be real, I was a graduate student and I needed to start my dissertation work and do this thing called a PhD, which was animated through years of working in trans health advocacy. So I spent 2 years in the Kinsey Institute archives on Indiana University's campus, looking at medical correspondence between doctors writing to each other in the 50s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. I interviewed providers around the United States who work with trans people, and I also attended trans healthcare conferences and observed them because I wanted to learn how they taught each other about how to work with trans and non-binary people. It became clear to me that when trans people show up in their clinics, what providers describe experiencing is like an existential crisis. Providers are rarely trained in offering gender-affirming interventions. Trans healthcare is mentioned at all on the one diversity day that occurs during a typical medical student's education. This lack of direct training, combined with most medical providers not having a lot of hands-on experience or opportunities to establish a body of medical knowledge to draw upon in trans medicine, raised a considerable amount of uncertainty for both physicians and also therapists. So in my field, as a sociologist, studying the social and cultural aspects of medicine, there's a lot of ongoing debate about how much or how little providers are trained to deal with uncertainty. But these providers of trans medicine are confronted with it every step of the way in their work with trans people. An essential reason why providers experience so much uncertainty is that they feel like they have very little evidence to draw from. I want to just say that I know that's a bold claim, and I feel like it's important to describe what I mean, because to say that providers have a lack of evidence is the very rationale that a lot of legislators have used to try to ban medical providers from from being able to offer trans-affirming care, especially to trans youth. So when I say that providers feel like they have little evidence to draw from, what I'm saying is that in medicine, evidence takes varied forms. So it can include data from research-driven activities such as clinical trials on the effects of pharmaceutical interventions or studies detailing the outcomes of medical procedures. There are clinical guidelines, which the WPATH guidelines came out, what was it, just last weekend? I would love to talk to folks about what they think about those guidelines. There's diagnostic criterias. All of these things offer providers guidance in recognizing symptoms and recommended steps for treatment plans. Evidence can also be culled from clinical experience and learning on the job. And as the opening scene made clear, gut instinct sometimes functions as evidence too. But the mere fact that providers richly described concerns about the lack of evidence signals something sociologically important about the context that shape providers who make this claim. So let's take Matthew, a physician who works in family care. As he said, quote, "If I'm treating someone with lung cancer, there are clinical studies where the N equals 3,000 people, or 6,000 people started on a new antibiotic. But for most of the studies in trans care, it's, we saw 4 trans women and we treated them. That's bothersome and makes a lot of providers uncomfortable." So again, I want to be clear that there is evidence in trans medicine. There's studies published on the efficacy of surgical techniques or the effects of hormone therapy on trans people's bodies. The physicians I spoke with acknowledged that those studies help them assess how much hormones to prescribe. But these kinds of published results did very little to help providers address how and when to initiate, continue, or block access to hormones, or how to interact with patients in the clinic. So Jill, a family care physician, emphatically stated, quote, "I don't like the idea of feeling like I'm holding a prescription pad as ransom, but I am a licensed provider. I do have to work within certain confines to continue to maintain a practice." Amelia, a gynecologist, echoed this idea, but focused on the challenges assessing risks and benefits. So she said, it's always a balance of risks and benefits. I think as long as it's done in the context of the patient, where the patient is the center of the discussion and a part of that discussion. But there are places where I will draw lines when the risks are too high. But in my own sentence, asking someone who is truly trans, and I just want to highlight the truly part of that sentence, someone who's truly trans to spend their life in a body that feels completely wrong is just horrible. It comes off feeling cruel. So providers are empathetic to the troubling aspect of blocking access to interventions. And some, like Amelia, who I just quoted, they narrated conflicting ideas about setting up these boundaries for patients and refusing to provide trans-related medicine. But what I'll also note is that using a qualifier like truly in relation to a trans person is crucial in revealing a central point in the tension between trans folk and healthcare providers. In a medical arena that involves treating an identity, who has the authority and expertise to decide if and when a person who claims a trans identity is so-called truly trans is highly contentious, as I'm sure that most folks in this room are fully aware. But this process of verification for an identity that has an endless number of permutations, it creates so much turmoil for healthcare providers. Most people, and I think that partly what's happening in trans medicine is that most people who make major life decisions rarely know if they are, and I use a lot of scare quotes, sorry, I don't want to keep highlighting scare quote 100% certain, until they experience the consequence of a decision. It's improbable for providers or trans people to know with 100% certainty that medical interventions are right for them. But from their perspective, providers don't think that they have the adequate tools to decide under what conditions it's acceptable to initiate or gatekeep gender-affirming interventions without questioning the underlying premise of this false construct. So Shannon, a physician's assistant, shared, when I'm working with a trans patient, I feel much more like we need to follow all of the steps. If I have a patient that's not super compliant, It's like I quickly get into a zone of, you're making it tough for me to help you here. We've got to follow the guidelines. You know what I mean? It's a real challenge. So as Shannon talked through the challenges of being asked to serve as a gatekeeper, she recognized that the guidelines helped provide a structure for her to make decisions within. She also acknowledged that when patients ask for workarounds to the guidelines, her first impulse is to cast her clients as non-compliant, which later in the interview she expressed some discomfort around. What I found interviewing providers is that some may unintentionally be engaging in trans exceptionalism, where they perceive trans patients as so unique and so different from cisgender patients that they have a difficult time importing evidence and also their experience from other areas of medicine into their decision-making and interactions with trans patients. But what else is driving these uncertainties? So in trans medicine, gender, as I'm sure a lot of folks in this room know, has been routed through both therapeutic and also physician communities. These pathways to care are rooted in mid-20th century understandings of who should treat trans people and in what kind of, here goes the scare quote again, disordered object is implied with treatment. So in part one of the book, I look at the development of the field of medicine in the middle of the 20th century. There were so few trans patients during this time period, and even fewer providers who worked in this medical area. So providers, and I know sometimes and even myself as someone who's both a social scientist and also a trans person, and I have to kind of toggle between, right now I'm like a social scientist, or right now I'm just like a pissed off trans person. But with so few trans patients during this time period and even fewer providers who worked in this medical arena in the mid-20th century, a lot of providers face accusations from those in the broader medical profession that they were so-called quacks. To establish their credibility, they instituted a set of criteria for sorting through so-called worthy patients that mandated normative gender expression. During this time, providers placed an extraordinary emphasis on normalizing trans people's bodies and experiences. Those patients whose gender closely aligned with traditional ideology were more readily granted access to hormone therapy and also surgical interventions. Trans people also had to demonstrate that they were model citizens in employment matters and also sexual desire. Meanwhile, around the 1960s, physicians realized that they needed therapists, they felt like they needed therapists, to help assess whether a patient seeking gender-affirming care was so-called truly trans or delusional. At this time, for folks who are not aware, being trans was understood as possibly a form of delusional thinking and also a symptom of schizophrenia. So there were these really intense legitimacy wars that erupted between therapists and physicians, and also between psychologists and psychiatrists, as each sought to establish themselves as the leading authorities in trans medicine. And as we might anticipate, they eventually figured out something where they could work together. And by the end of the 1970s, physicians and therapists began working together in a team approach. And yet, what I want to suggest is that some of the historical ways that the medical establishment understood trans people continues today. So, sorry, now I'm looking at the time and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have so much more to talk about. So in kind of the second half of my book, there's this lingering question that really is unresolved from those legitimacy wars that started in the middle of the 20th century. And the question sounds something like this. Is the goal of treatment to bring the mind into alignment with the body, or to change one's body to bring relief to one's mental health state? And rather than taking a position on this debate, a lot of providers have operated from the tacit assumption that the best way forward in medical decision-making is to understand trans identification as both a mental health issue, placing trans people under the jurisdiction of therapists, and to work from a biomedical model of care which places trans people under the jurisdiction of physicians and surgeons. This has created a double whammy effect of medicalization in trans people's lives, as we are subject to medical authority from both therapists and physicians. And in health encounters where the power differentials can be so extreme between provider and patient, whose knowledge of gender, it matters. And it can also alter the pathways to decision-making that providers and patients undergo. So I'm just gonna offer a couple more examples, but I'll try to also think about how to cut about 5 of 10 pages from my talk. I argue throughout my book that how gender is defined, and also by whom, reflects dominant norms about proper gender identification and bodily displays. And this becomes particularly troubling when we consider that medical professionals are experts. We expect them to know what they're doing. And I know that there are medical providers in this audience, and I don't necessarily mean to be offensive or insulting, but I'm calling you into the conversation. But like I tell a lot of my students at Michigan State, as we grapple with these questions, if I have a toothache, I'm gonna go to the dentist. And if I have a legal issue, I'm gonna go to the lawyer. If I have questions about my gender, why would I go to a doctor? Wouldn't a gender studies professor make more sense? But because of the medical model, we have come to expect that providers are experts over gender itself. And I spend a lot of my time in my work thinking about expertise. And there are some providers, for sure, who are open about the fact that they felt like they lacked expertise in working with trans people. And in my work, I've referred to them as uncertain experts. So these were providers who were able to lean comfortably into the uncertainty that's pervasive in trans medicine. They were flexible in their interpretations of clinical guidelines, protocols. They acknowledged that when we're thinking about new medical fields, it's difficult because there's a lack of scientific evidence, there's a lack of clinical experience, and there's a lack of medical training. But how they negotiated their own uncertainty and expertise involved a couple of different strategies. So one is they talked about how they use gut instinct. Uncertain experts were open to sharing that they were anything but experts in trans medicine. So Janet, a primary care provider who had several trans patients and lived in a rural area, said, you know, providers don't like not knowing things. To have something within the spectrum of my specialty that I don't know about makes me uncomfortable. Trans medicine definitely falls into that category, and I just sort of have to go with my gut and do what I think is best for the patient. Uncertain experts describe challenges along the way in reconciling this tension that they faced in being called upon as experts while having little evidence and sometimes little clinical experience to draw from. So as Sandra put it, quote, I would say the biggest challenge for me is the lack of knowledge and experience. And some of that's reflective of the field itself, as trans medicine is based on a lot of theory and conjecture. But as probably a lot of us in this room have experienced, not all is well in trans medicine. And there was a separate group of providers. So those that I refer to as self-assured experts, who tended to assume that decision-making is objective and standardized, to shore up their own concerns about a lack of expertise. They doubled down on their medical authority and reverted back to a paternalistic model of care, which is sometimes referred to as doctor knows best, and patients are expected to be compliant. So what I show is that a lot of these providers use the language, especially the language of scientific evidence, which has so much power, although since the book comes out, I think because of all of the politicking that's happened in the last 2 years around science, that maybe has been, crumbled a little bit. But what I show is that a lot of providers use the language of scientific evidence to gloss over their lack of expertise, and also to deflect attention away from taken for granted assumptions. And this is the place where I want to share that one or two of the quotes that I'm about to present are difficult to hear and also quite insulting. So self-assured experts leveraged interpretations of scientific evidence, but presumed or presented them to be capital F facts to bolster their claims to expert status. For example, during a grand round session on new research in trans medicine that's organized on behalf of a local hospital, the presenter, who is an endocrinologist, looked out into the crowd of both new and seasoned medical providers and began his presentation by asking, quote, "What is the easiest way to change someone's gender?" And his response was castration. The audience erupted in laughter. The point I believe he's trying to make is that removing an individual's gonads would help that person's body absorb the hormones that were introduced through hormone therapy. However, this endocrinologist is also insinuating that one's bodily configuration determines one's gender. In further detailing, and it's really hard actually to spend your work in your life observing these kinds of encounters. And I really appreciate having this space to share some of these stories, and also hearing people's what the fuck. Yeah, it's really messed up. So he kind of continued, and what he said was, when it comes to female to males, and this is an exact quote, "The goal is to stop the menses. That's going to be the single most important thing that you do. They no longer will have a sense of belonging to another gender." So the message seems to be that, at least for trans men as an example, you inject a little testosterone, you add in a swagger while walking, you top it off with a hint of musk and some increased muscle mass, and you got a man. But these ideas about gender that are understood through a medical perspective and supported by gender stereotypes become packaged as scientific fact. This way of presenting information to each other, from Trans 101 workshops to discussions of surgical success stories, leaves little room for ambiguity in clinical practice and meaning making of what role medicine might have to offer in working with people in our gender identities. So I'll offer just a couple of more examples before I wrap up. As Evan, a family care physician, put it, quote, "When I get a patient who does not have a clear, solid gender identity or goal of changing, I get concerned about what is my role. I'm the medical person. I'm not the therapist. I'm not the social worker. I'm not the support groups. I'm not the social service people." So those are the folks, non-binary people, by the way, where I don't know that medical physical transition or stopping of current gender presentation is the right way to go. So as Evan suggests, for those trans people who seek medical interventions, they need to assure providers that they are so-called, and here it comes up again, truly trans. In the process, trans people are mandated to be good, normative, worthy patients who can clearly articulate why they are seeking medical interventions to avoid gatekeeping. These practices are not without consequence, as trans people seek medical interventions are always under the surveillance of medical providers who hold more power in healthcare encounters. I'm gonna skip ahead because I always like to end on a little bit of an up note. Because I've been let me just drag us through the mud of the horrible shit that we all have to go through and as trans people. I do want to emphasize that there are unanticipated joys that providers find in their work with trans people. So I ended the interviews with trans providers by asking a very simple question. What do you find joyful about working with trans patients? And these providers, I'm already getting goosebumps. These providers, even the ones who offered kind of disgusting and slightly insulting things to say, they had a lot to say about what they found joyful about working with us. And I think that partly it's because they don't always realize the unintentional but devastating consequences of how they think about trans medicine. So let me offer you one or two quotes about what trans providers, or what providers who work with trans people find joyful. Martha, a family care provider, shared, "You know, the more that I work with trans people, I think I became a better doctor. It's hard, but I learned how to listen to my patients, and as hard as it is, to not make assumptions about them." So as Martha reflects, part of her learning process was breaking down some of her own barriers, learning to hit the pause button and reflect on what assumptions she was making about her trans patients. As she later reflected, she was able to bring this way of patient care into all of her interactions. As she described, it helped her learn more about her patients, it helped her ask better questions, and gain insight into the lives of her patients that is not only about gender identity, but sources of social support, stressors in people's lives, and also major life events. Brandon, a psychologist, reflected, "You know, for younger psychologists that I train, I teach them that in trans medicine, our job is to help people navigate the complexities of the impact of social inequalities on trans people's lives and help them figure out how to cope with, as best they can, the reality of their own lived experience and circumstances. We need to acknowledge that there isn't something deficient or wrong with them." Moreover, because of I like the snaps, thank you. Moreover, because of an accumulation of negative experiences that a lot of us have had, providers offer a perspective sometimes that comes from gender justice organizing, to recognize and acknowledge that each human has value. As simple as that might sound, in a separate project that I don't clearly have time to present, a lot of trans folk do not think that healthcare professionals value them. So Peter says, "It's really gratifying to see the fear start to ebb away as people recognize that here's a provider who believes in them, who's going to interact with them as a fully valuable human being." And now I'm going to wrap up real quick. So just to kind of close it all up, in response to the continuing lack of evidence and vast uncertainty, what I found is that there are some providers who will double down on their authority, insisting that they're the providers and patients should follow their orders. This group of providers holds a principled view that medical authority helps to create order in a decision-making process that from their perspective feels disordered. But other providers are more flexible, and they describe working, but also sometimes stumbling their way towards clarity and what a best practice might look like. They seek to find a middle ground between patients' needs and medical authority. In the process, many of these providers find that they learn more about gender and the everyday lives of patients who are seeking their help in gender transitions. But my findings point to the vital need for all healthcare providers to be properly trained in working with trans people, which would also have spillover effects in more adequately meeting the needs of all patients, learning to work within gender variance, and also avoiding the perpetuation of healthcare inequalities. As more providers confront trans patients in their clinical encounters, my findings suggest that providers need to refine their thinking of trans people as like a puzzle to solve or a problem to fix, and instead, with little scientific evidence to support choosing one course of action over another, providers need to become more flexible in navigating professional norms and to begin placing more trust in their trans clients as the experts over our own bodies and identities. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shuster.